We will survive, my daughter. We will never beg anyone." Long before scandal, disgrace, and police sirens ever touched their home, Sandra believed her mother was the closest thing to a real-life angel. Their two-room apartment was small, the windows old, the ceilings patched with cardboard, and the kitchen sometimes smelled of kerosene whenever the stove misbehaved. Yet Sandra always felt rich, not because of money, but because of the warmth that lived inside those walls. At 16, she had seen enough of life to know that some mothers loved with their lips, but her mother, Mrs. Nkem, loved with her entire being. She woke at 4:30 a.m. every morning, washed her uniform by hand, pressed it on a wooden ironing board, and tied her headscarf neatly before leaving for the hospital. Neighbors admired her, patients adored her, and doctors depended heavily on her efficiency. She treated everyone, from stubborn old men to crying toddlers, with the same gentle patience. To the community, she was Nurse Nkem, the woman who never raised her voice, never turned patients away, and never took credit for her sacrifices. To Sandra, she was a hero, the only hero she had ever known since her father died when she was 9. It was the memory of her father's funeral, the coldness of her relatives, and the unbearable silence in the house afterward that made Sandra cling to her mother so tightly. She remembered the nights her mother cried quietly in the dark, thinking her daughter was asleep. She remembered how her mother wiped those tears and told her, "We will survive, my daughter. We will never beg anyone." That vow formed Sandra's childhood, a childhood built on dignity, honesty, and the belief that her mother would never bend her principles, no matter how hard life became. But life was becoming harder in ways Sandra didn't understand. School fees doubled. Bills piled up. The hospital delayed salaries due to management issues. Everything around them seemed to be falling apart at once. Sandra noticed her mother's smiles shrinking, slowly replaced by a distant heaviness. She began leaving the house earlier and returning much later. Some nights, she would sit at the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, lost in thoughts she refused to share. At first, Sandra assumed it was exhaustion. Her mother worked in the busiest government hospital in the area. Women in labor screaming at midnight, emergency cases rushing in, children battling malaria, men injured from motorcycle accidents, the kind of chaos that drained the strongest hearts. But this exhaustion was different. It came with whispers, with secret phone calls made outside, with unexpected visitors who arrived late in the evening and left quickly, speaking in hushed tones. One day, Sandra overheard her mother talking to a colleague, a woman with overly bright lipstick and a careless laugh. "Don't worry," the woman whispered. "This is small money. Easy money. Nobody will ever suspect you. Everybody does it." Sandra couldn't understand what it was, but the tone unsettled her. She asked no questions, but the discomfort lingered. Even more confusing was her mother's sudden shift in financial behavior. The same woman who once hesitated to buy a new kettle suddenly replaced their refrigerator. She bought a high-quality school sandal for Sandra without negotiation. She restocked the kitchen with items they usually bought monthly. She even gave Sandra pocket money twice that week. And although Sandra should have felt happy, she felt something else, something heavy and unfamiliar: suspicion. But because she trusted her mother deeply, she swallowed her doubts. She convinced herself everything was fine. After all, her mother had always been the strongest person she knew. Surely nothing could break her. Yet deep inside the hospital walls, where no patient could see and where most nurses pretended not to notice, something was shifting. Rumors floated through corridors, quiet concerns about drugs not working the way they should. A malaria patient returned looking worse than before. A mother cried that her child reacted severely to cough syrup that was supposed to help. And one afternoon, Sandra's mother came home unusually quiet, her eyes swollen as though she had spent the entire day trying not to cry. She didn't speak much during dinner. She merely pushed her food around, lost in thoughts too dark to say out loud. That night, Sandra heard her mother on the phone, whispering furiously, "You promised me it was safe. You said nobody would trace it. My patients are suffering. Do you want to destroy my career?" The voice on the other end, harsh, arrogant, unbothered, replied, "Calm down. Nothing will happen. Just pay what you owe and keep quiet." Sandra froze behind the curtain. Her heartbeat pounded so loudly she feared her mother would hear it. A strange fear wrapped around her, the kind that makes your skin cold and your stomach tight. She wanted to ask questions. What was happening? Who was that man? Why did her mother sound trapped? But she also feared the answer. So she did what children often do when the world becomes bigger than their understanding. She pretended she heard nothing. She went back to bed, pulled the blanket over her head, and prayed silently. God, please keep my mummy safe. For a few days, life pretended to return to normal. Her mother resumed smiling, resumed giving patients their medications, resumed returning home with foodstuffs she could barely afford before. But beneath every smile was the shadow of something growing: guilt, fear, or perhaps both. Then, one Thursday afternoon, everything changed. Sandra was in her classroom copying notes when her teacher entered with a grave expression and asked her to come outside. "Your mother fainted at work," she said quietly. Panic exploded inside Sandra. She ran out of the school compound without waiting for permission. By the time she reached the hospital, she found chaos, nurses whispering, a doctor shaking his head, patients gathered in clusters. The air carried a strange tension, like a storm waiting to break. At the center of it all was a young pregnant woman being rushed into the emergency ward. Her husband shouted, "She took the drugs your nurse gave her. She's collapsing. Somebody help." Sandra stood rooted, trembling, watching as 3 nurses whispered her mother's name. That was the moment Sandra realized the world she trusted was breaking apart. She felt it, the quiet dread, the heavy eyes of the staff, the sudden panic in the air. Something terrible was coming, and it was coming for her mother. And as she stood there in confusion and fear, hearing the first whispers of blame and suspicion, she knew deep down that whatever storm was approaching, it had already begun. The breaking point didn't come with thunder or warning. It came quietly, disguised as an ordinary afternoon in the hospital. Mrs. Nkem had just finished her morning ward round when her colleague, Nurse Ozioma, approached her with a smile that never reached her eyes. She was one of those nurses who always smelled of expensive perfume, but complained about having no money. That day, she leaned close and whispered, "Sister Nkem, I know you're struggling. There's a way to make extra cash without stress." At first, Mrs. Nkem dismissed her with a wave of the hand, thinking it was one of those gossip-driven shortcuts that ended badly. But Ozioma pressed on, describing a small business, where nurses bought private drugs from wholesalers and resold them to patients for profit. She made it sound normal, like everyone was doing it, like it wasn't harmful, like it wasn't illegal. When Mrs. Nkem hesitated, Ozioma dropped the final bait. "You're a widow. Nobody will help you. Don't die suffering." Those words hit deeper than she expected. A widow. Alone. Struggling. Something inside her softened, and in that weakened moment, a door opened, the wrong door. That evening, with bills piled on the table and her heart heavy, her resolve slowly weakened. She replayed Ozioma's words like a song she didn't want to hear, but couldn't silence. The supplier they spoke about called her, speaking with a smoothness that felt rehearsed. He promised good profits, quick sales, harmless transactions. "These drugs work fine," he said. "Hospitals overcharge people. You're helping them." The lie was delivered so confidently that it almost sounded like truth. Mrs. Nkem allowed herself to believe it, not because she was greedy, but because she was desperate. She thought of Sandra's school fees, her growing needs, the shame of borrowing money, the humiliation of asking her in-laws for help and being mocked. Her pride was wounded, her spirit tired, and in that emotional blindness, she agreed to buy the drugs. The next day, a small black nylon bag arrived at her doorstep, filled with packets of tablets and syrups that looked genuine to the untrained eye. She placed them on her table and stared at them for a long time. They looked harmless. They looked convenient. They looked like an escape. What she didn't know was that every single one of them was a ticking time bomb waiting to destroy everything she had built. The first sale was the hardest, not in action, but in guilt. A mother brought in her coughing son, asking for help, and instead of directing her to the hospital pharmacy, Mrs. Nkem hesitated, then handed her the counterfeit syrup. The woman thanked her repeatedly, unaware she was leaving with poison disguised as hope. When she paid, the extra cash felt heavy in Mrs. Nkem's palm. Wrong. Dirty. But also necessary. With time, the guilt dulled, and the money began solving problems that had bullied her for months. School fees were paid. Debts cleared. Groceries filled the home. Even Sandra noticed her mother smiling a little more, cooking fuller meals, fixing broken things in the house. At first, Sandra felt relieved. She thought her mother had finally found stability. But every gain came with a growing shadow. A patient returned with worsened symptoms. Another came back complaining that the drugs did nothing. 2 children fell critically ill. Rumors began slipping through the hospital corridors like cold wind. "Something is wrong with our supplies." Somebody is selling fake medicines. Yet no one suspected Nurse Nkem, the gentle, trustworthy, always smiling widow. She blended in like a saint hiding a scar under her sleeve. But deep inside, she felt the foundations cracking. Every time she opened that black nylon bag, her hands trembled a little more. The night everything changed. Sandra was on her way to the kitchen when she heard her mother whispering angrily on the phone. Her voice, normally calm, sounded shaky and desperate. "You promised me these drugs were genuine. Patients are reacting badly. I can't continue like this." The words sliced through the air. Sandra froze. She recognized fear in her mother's voice, a fear she hadn't heard since the night her father died. She stayed hidden, clutching the wall, as her mother argued about money, suppliers, threats, and risk. When the call ended, Mrs. Nkem sank into the sofa, face buried in her palms. Sandra watched silently, heart pounding, realizing, without understanding, that something terrible was unfolding. She wanted to ask questions, but fear glued her lips shut. Something told her this was bigger, darker, more dangerous than anything she had ever imagined. And she was right, because somewhere across town, police officers were already planning a raid on the supplier's hideout. And once he was caught, her mother's name, her mother's secret, would be dragged into light. The police raid happened at dawn, that quiet hour when most people are suspended between sleep and waking, when even the wind seems unsure of itself. But for the black market drug supplier, dawn arrived with a thunderstorm of boots, shouts, and handcuffs. In less than 5 minutes, the entire illegal pharmacy was reduced to chaos. Drugs scattered across the floor, shelves broken, men yelling as officers dragged them out one by one. The supplier tried to run, but he was caught at the back door like a rat caught between hunger and escape. Under pressure, shaking and sweating, he spilled everything: the source of the drugs, the distribution chain, the names of everyone involved. And among the list, written in his frightened voice, was one name the officers didn't expect. Nurse Nkem, the senior nurse at the community hospital. At that very moment, miles away, Mrs. Nkem was at the hospital trying to act normal, her voice trembling as she spoke to patients, her hands cold despite the humid weather. She felt something was coming, a silent storm gathering at the edge of her life. Guilt had robbed her of sleep, appetite, and peace, but the consequences had not yet come. Not yet. She didn't know that as she adjusted a patient's bedsheet, the final thread of secrecy had already snapped. The tragedy unfolded in front of everyone, in a way no one could ever forget. A young pregnant woman, barely in her mid-20s, walked into the hospital with her mother, complaining of dizziness and weakness. She had been fine the day before. In fact, she had taken drugs prescribed by none other than Mrs. Nkem. That small detail should have brought comfort, but fate had something darker in mind. Within minutes of arriving, the woman collapsed in the reception area. Staff rushed in. Doctors shouted orders. Nurses scrambled to assist. But the moment the pharmacist opened the drug sachet she had taken, his eyes widened. The seal was wrong, the color slightly off, the texture unfamiliar. Alarm bells rang instantly. "This drug is fake," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. The senior doctor's face changed. Without waiting for explanations, he ordered a quiet, internal investigation. Nobody pointed fingers yet. Nobody accused anyone. But the hospital atmosphere shifted, a heaviness settled, and suspicion crawled across the walls like smoke trying to find the source of a fire. Staff whispered. Patients watched. And as fate would have it, Sandra herself was sitting outside her mother's office at that moment, waiting for her to finish shift. She heard bits and pieces of the murmurs. She saw the way nurses glanced at her mother with questions in their eyes. She noticed how her mother kept forcing a smile, as if holding her soul together with shaking hands. Sandra had always seen her mother as a pillar, strong, hardworking, loved by many, but that hour revealed a side of her she had never seen. A restless, frightened, guilty woman trying to hide the weight of her choices. Mrs. Nkem kept pacing the hallway, her breath shallow, her fingers shaking uncontrollably. She knew the drugs had finally spoken. She knew the investigation would expose the truth she had tried to bury under silence and desperation. That evening, as they walked home, Sandra dared to ask the question burning holes in her chest. "Mummy, what is happening in the hospital?" But instead of answering, Mrs. Nkem stopped walking. Tears filled her eyes, fragile and trembling, like someone whose heart was collapsing under the weight of her secrets. She pulled Sandra close and whispered, "I made a mistake, a terrible one." That confession, soft as it was, shattered Sandra's innocence. She didn't understand the full story yet, but she felt the danger in her mother's trembling voice. The rest of the walk home was silent, a silence that held fear, regret, and unspoken truths. That night, Sandra didn't sleep. She kept replaying her mother's words. "I made a mistake," over and over. She didn't know that at that same moment, the police were reviewing statements from the arrested supplier. And in their report, a familiar name had reappeared, clear, bold, undeniable. The morning of the arrest felt unreal. Sandra had barely touched her breakfast when they heard a knock at the door, a heavy, official knock that didn't belong to visitors or neighbors. Mrs. Nkem opened the door, and there they stood. Two officers in uniform, stern-faced, holding documents. Her heart sank before they even spoke. Sandra felt her world tilt. The officers' words echoed like thunder. "Mrs. Nkem, you are needed for questioning regarding counterfeit drug distribution." The neighbors gathered instantly, whispering a mixture of shock, disbelief, and judgment. Some held their phones, recording. Others stood with hands over their mouths. Sandra watched in horror as her mother was handcuffed, not roughly, but firmly enough to break her spirit. Tears streamed down Mrs. Nkem's face as she tried to turn back to reassure her daughter. "Sandra, I'm sorry," she whispered. That moment carved itself deeply into the girl's heart. The hospital suspended her the same day. The news spread across the community like wildfire. The same woman who once saved lives was now accused of harming them. Sandra faced humiliation at school. Children mocked her. Parents whispered. Even teachers looked at her with quiet pity. She felt like her mother's shame had become her own. And yet, deep inside, she prayed for one thing: that her mother would choose truth over fear. And she did. In court, overwhelmed by guilt, Mrs. Nkem confessed everything: the debts, the pressure, the influence, the stupidity, the regret. She accepted responsibility, not to escape punishment, but to begin healing. Her sentence was reduced because she cooperated. And when she finally returned home months later, fragile but determined, Sandra hugged her tightly and whispered, "We will rise again, Mum." Because sometimes redemption starts from the ashes of the worst mistakes. And healing begins in the hands of those who still choose love after the world chooses shame. The months after the court verdict felt like walking through a desert, endless, dry, and unforgiving. When Mrs. Nkem returned home, it wasn't the same home she left behind. The neighborhood was colder. People's eyes carried judgment, their whispers sharp enough to cut through a person's confidence. Children who once waved at her now hid behind their mothers. Market women paused when she passed, lowering their voices as if her presence contaminated their air. Sandra felt each of these moments like stones thrown at her spirit, but she refused to let her mother face them alone. On the first morning after her return, she woke early, swept the compound, cooked a simple breakfast, and sat beside her mother, quietly holding her hand. Mrs. Nkem's shoulders shook with silent tears, not just from the shame, but from the fear that she had broken the one person who still believed in her. Sandra lifted her chin and said softly, "Mummy, we can't change the past, but we can build the future." It was that sentence, spoken by a girl who had watched her world collapse, that marked the beginning of their slow rise. Not dramatic, not immediate, just a small flame of hope refusing to die. But rebuilding wasn't easy. The hospital had already replaced her. No health center wanted to hire a nurse with a scandal attached to her name, even though the court had shown mercy. Her certificates were untouched, her years of service undeniable, but society's memory is sharp when it comes to mistakes. Weeks passed with rejection after rejection. Each time she returned home with slumped shoulders, Sandra would meet her at the door. "What happened?" she would ask gently. And her mother would shake her head with forced courage. "Maybe tomorrow." Sandra watched as her once strong mother struggled to even hold a pen without her fingers trembling. Guilt ate her alive. Every rejection reopened the wound she carried inside. One evening, when she returned from yet another failed job search, she broke down completely. "Sandra, I have ruined my life. I have ruined yours. I don't deserve forgiveness." Sandra knelt before her, cupped her mother's face, and wiped her tears. "You made a mistake," she said firmly, "but you are still my mother. And you taught me to fight. We'll start again. Slowly. But we will start." It was that relentless belief, firm, stubborn, unshaken, that finally began breaking through Mrs. Nkem's walls of fear and self-hate. She started sewing old clothes to make little money. Sandra helped her sell snacks at school. They cut expenses, shared meals, prayed together, and slowly built a new rhythm of survival. Hope returned in a surprising way. A small community clinic, run by an elderly doctor who had known Mrs. Nkem before the scandal, decided to give her a chance. Not because he doubted her guilt, but because he believed in second chances. "I know what you did was wrong," he told her. "But I also know desperation can push even good people to dark corners. Come, work under supervision. No drugs handling for now. Just basic nursing duties." It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't her old status. But it was a doorway, a fragile one, but a doorway nonetheless. On her first day back in uniform, even if it was an old faded gown, Sandra insisted on walking her to the clinic. She straightened her collar, adjusted her hair, and smiled proudly. "You look like a nurse again, Mummy." And Mrs. Nkem, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to smile back. At the clinic, patients were hesitant at first. Some recognized her. Some didn't. Some whispered. But over the weeks, something surprising happened. Her true nature resurfaced. She handled wounds gently. She spoke with warmth. She comforted patients the way she always used to before greed clouded her judgment. The elderly doctor observed quietly and eventually told her, "This is the version of you the world needs, Nkem. Stay here. Start small. Rebuild." And rebuild she did. Slowly. Patiently. Humbly. Each day became a testimony of change, not perfection. She hadn't forgotten the past. She simply refused to be imprisoned by it anymore. Meanwhile, Sandra herself was changing. The humiliation at school had once felt unbearable, but watching her mother fight to stand again transformed her pain into determination. She began studying harder, pushing herself academically as if her success could somehow sew back the torn pieces of their lives. Teachers noticed her improvement. One teacher in particular, Mrs. Adebayo, saw the fire in her eyes. After class one day, she pulled Sandra aside and said, "I don't know everything you're going through, but I see strength in you. If you keep this up, you will rewrite your future." Those words became her anchor. She joined school competitions, volunteered in the library, became more focused and responsible. And soon, the same students who mocked her began admiring her resilience. She didn't fight them. She didn't explain anything. She simply rose quietly, steadily, beautifully. One day after school, she walked into the clinic where her mother worked. Mrs. Nkem was cleaning a patient's wound with her usual gentle care. The patient's child said, "Ani nurse, thank you. God bless you." The sincerity of that blessing pierced through her like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sandra watched the moment with pride swelling in her chest. She leaned against the door frame and whispered, "We're rising, Mummy, slowly, but we're rising." And for the first time since the scandal began, Mrs. Nkem believed her. The morning started like any other, quiet, ordinary, and almost forgettable. But destiny hides its biggest surprises inside ordinary days. The sun had barely risen when Mrs. Nkem left home for the clinic, carrying her small faded bag and the same determined spirit that had kept her going. She didn't know that this day would change everything. At the clinic, things were unusually busy. A group of volunteers from an international health foundation had arrived to conduct free medical outreach. The supervising doctor, the same elderly man who had given her a second chance, introduced her to them as one of the nurses assisting with patient care. Among the visitors was a tall woman in her early 40s, smartly dressed, with kind eyes and quiet authority. Her name was Dr. Miriam Ojua, the head of the foundation's outreach team. When she noticed Mrs. Nkem attending to a child with a high fever, she paused and watched. Every move, the way Nkem cleaned the wound gently, comforted the frightened mother, spoke softly to the child, carried the grace of someone born to heal. When they finished, Dr. Miriam smiled and said, "You've been doing this for years, haven't you?" Mrs. Nkem smiled shyly. "Yes, ma'am, though I had to start all over again." Dr. Miriam tilted her head. "Start over? What happened?" For a moment, silence filled the small clinic. Nkem hesitated, then whispered, "I made a terrible mistake once. I lost everything, but I'm trying to earn back what I threw away." That simple confession, honest, stripped of pride, struck something deep in Dr. Miriam. After the day's outreach ended, she called the clinic's head aside and asked about Nkem's story. The doctor told her everything. The scandal, the court case, the remorse, and the remarkable discipline she had shown since her return. Dr. Miriam was silent for a long moment, then said, "I want to meet her again privately." The next day, she sat with Nkem in the small clinic office. "You remind me of someone," she began softly. "My mother. She was a nurse too. She once lost her license because of a similar mistake. Poverty pushed her into a dark place. but she rebuilt her life and eventually trained me into the doctor I am today. Nkem's eyes filled with tears. Then you understand, she said, her voice trembling. You understand how one wrong step can stain everything you've worked for. Dr. Miriam nodded. I do. And I also know redemption is real, but only if the person is truly changed. I see that in you. She reached into her folder and pulled out a small card. We're opening a new branch of our foundation clinic in Nsukka. We need senior nurses with experience. If you're willing to relocate, I'll recommend you. Nkem froze, her hands shaking. Me, she whispered. After all I've done? Dr. Miriam smiled. Especially because of what you've done and what you've learned. When Nkem came home that night, Sandra noticed the light in her eyes before she even spoke. Mummy, what happened? She asked eagerly. Nkem sat down, too overwhelmed to form words. Finally, she said quietly, God gave me another chance. Sandra blinked, confused. Another chance? Her mother handed her the card. A new job. In Nsukka. At a foundation clinic. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Sandra screamed and hugged her mother tightly. They laughed, cried, danced, and prayed all at once. It wasn't just about the job. It was about dignity, restored, renewed, and redeemed. The next weeks moved fast. The clinic arranged her relocation, helped her settle into a small apartment, and within a month, Mrs. Nkem was wearing a new uniform, crisp white, name badge shining, eyes full of life again. Her dedication quickly caught the attention of the foundation director. Patients loved her. Younger nurses admired her discipline and gentleness. She became the nurse people trusted again. The woman once known for a scandal was now known for her compassion. Sandra, now in university, would visit during holidays and help with patient record keeping. Every time she saw her mother in action, she felt like she was witnessing a living miracle. It was during one of these visits that life came full circle. A middle-aged woman entered the clinic one morning with her teenage daughter. She looked familiar, but it took a moment before recognition struck. It was the wife of the pharmacist who had helped expose the fake drug scandal years earlier. The woman looked nervous when she saw Nkem. I didn't know you worked here, she stammered. Nkem smiled gently. Yes, life took me here. The woman lowered her eyes. I came to say, I'm sorry for how things ended. I didn't know your story then. Nkem shook her head. You don't owe me an apology. You did what was right. The woman squeezed her hand. Still, I'm glad you're standing again. When she left, Sandra turned to her mother and said softly, You see, Mummy? Even the people who once judged you now respect you. Tears welled up in Mrs. Nkem's eyes, but this time, they were tears of peace, not shame. She looked up and whispered, Thank you, God, for turning my disgrace into grace. That night, as the sun set over Nsukka, the streets bathed in gold, she sat by the window with Sandra. The same woman who had once lost everything now had something stronger, redemption, purpose, and peace. Sandra rested her head on her mother's shoulder and said, You taught me something, Mummy. What's that? Her mother asked softly. That a mistake can break you, but it can also make you if you don't give up. And with that, the story of their survival became not just a tale of greed and shame, but a testament to grace, courage, and the power of second chances. Years passed, and the story of Mrs. Nkem became more than a private testimony. It quietly grew into a tale whispered in hospital corridors, told among young nurses, and remembered by anyone who had ever fallen and struggled to rise again. Not because she was perfect, but because she wasn't. Every scar she carried became a lesson. Every tear she shed became a warning. Every victory she earned became a light for someone else walking through darkness. Her journey taught people that redemption is real, but it demands courage. Forgiveness exists, but it requires humility. And second chances come, but only to those who have learned from the ashes of their mistakes. As her reputation grew in the Nsukka community, the foundation where she worked invited her to speak at an annual health conference, something she never imagined she would ever do again. On the day of her speech, she stood backstage trembling, holding the microphone with sweaty palms. Memories rushed back, the courtroom, the shame, the nights she cried alone. But then another memory rose stronger. The first child she treated after returning to the clinic. That child had smiled at her with complete trust. That single smile had rebuilt her confidence when words could not. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage. The hall fell silent. My name is Nkem, she began, her voice calm. And I stand before you as someone who broke and was rebuilt. Gasps filled the room. But what followed was not a story of disgrace. It was a story of resilience. She spoke about the importance of honesty in healthcare, the temptation of shortcuts, the consequences of desperation, and the healing power of accountability. When she finished, the audience rose to their feet. Some clapped, some cried, some whispered, "That could have been me." After the conference, messages began pouring in. Young nurses asked for mentorship. Rural clinics requested her help in setting up safe drug practices. Even healthcare workers who had once judged her reached out, saying, "Your story saved me. I was about to make the same mistake." And suddenly, her greatest pain became her greatest contribution to the world. Sandra watched all of this with quiet pride. She often told her mother, "Your downfall became someone else's warning. Your comeback became someone else's courage." And Nkem always replied, "That is why God kept me alive." As the years moved on, her life finally settled into a gentle rhythm, peaceful, stable, meaningful. She never became rich, but she became something far greater, useful. Nurses came to her for advice. Patients trusted her more than any other. Even the foundation leadership relied on her judgment during training programs. It was as if the universe itself had rewritten her story, not to erase the past, but to redeem it. One evening, during Harmattan, Sandra, now a young woman working in physiotherapy, visited her mother. They sat outside under the orange glow of sunset as dry winds brushed the earth. Birds circled lazily above them. "Mummy," Sandra began softly, "if you could change your past, would you?" Mrs. Nkem thought for a long moment. "Once upon a time," she whispered, "I would have said yes. I would have begged God to rewrite everything. But now, I understand." She turned to her daughter with calm eyes. "If I didn't fall, I wouldn't have become who I am today. My pain disciplined me. My shame humbled me. My journey taught others. And you saw it all. You learned things no school could teach." Sandra nodded quietly. She knew it was true. Their bond had been forged in fire. Their courage had been shaped by struggle. Their faith had been tested and strengthened through storms. As darkness settled and stars blinked awake, Sandra leaned against her mother and whispered, "So what lesson should the world learn from your story?" Nkem smiled, a soft, honest smile that carried the weight of everything she had lived through. "Tell them this," she said. "Mistakes do not end a person. Pride does." She looked up at the stars. "If you fall, stand up. If you break, heal. If you sin, confess. If you lose your way, return. No road is too dark for a person who carries a little light inside." Sandra closed her eyes and breathed deeply, knowing her mother's story would live long after them. It was a tale of warning, a tale of hope, and above all, a tale of rebirth. And so, the world learned something powerful, that the human spirit, no matter how wounded, can rise again. Stronger, wiser, kinder. This was not just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a legacy. A legacy born from tears, strengthened by truth, and crowned by grace.